Good morning, everybody. Welcome to our first ever Transfer Pricing Lab seminar. So we're here today. Hope you've got a coffee. Hope you're ready for an interesting conversation. We have a number of different things planned today. 3 different topics. I'm going to run you through that. I'm going to give you an introduction to what is the TP Lab, what's the plan with that, introduce our co-host today, and then and take it from there. But firstly, my name is Tim Holmes. I'm a partner in PwC Transfer Pricing. I'm also responsible for tax and legal technology, so a couple of dual role there, and very much looking forward to sharing this 1 hour with you. So firstly, what is TP Labs? We plan to do 3 or 4 of these sessions. It should be informal. We want to have some conversations around the table. It won't be deep technical dives. It'll be kind of ad hoc conversations. We're going to bring in people from the network, a mixture of topics. So we're going to do some TP technical topics, some transfer pricing, deep dives, some international updates, and of course, technology as well. So a number of different things. Today's topic is a little bit of clickbait, upcoming recession. Do we have one? Do we not? We don't know. But we wanted to put some interesting conversations together today. Firstly, what should you be thinking about if we have a crisis? What are the tools you can use? I'm going to talk to Olga about maps, how you can use a map in a potential crisis situation. We're going to talk to Daniel from PwC UK. HMRC has some very interesting developments coming our way. And I think in any crisis situation, clearly there's a need for governments to get some more cash. And they do that through transfer pricing quite commonly. And I think HMRC is ahead of the curve. So we're going to hear from him. And then lastly, we'll talk to Bori about operational transfer pricing. So how do you make sure you actually hit your targets? Super important in a crisis. If you're changing your targets, you really want to make sure you're on the money. So that's our plan for today. So a quick round of introductions. I'll ask Olga, you to go first, and then Bori, and then Daniel on the line.
Yeah, good morning, everyone. I'm Olga. I joined PwC transfer pricing team recently, and immediately before I worked in Skat in the team called the Danish Competent Authority. This is the specialized team which works with APAs and maps. And before that, I worked with transfer pricing for more than 10 years in another Big Four. Bori?
Yes, thank you. Hi, everyone. My name is Bori. I work with PwC more than 2 years now. I'm a senior associate in the transfer pricing department. And I am also specializing in technology, and I am a digital accelerator as well.
Hello, everybody. My name is Daniel Pound. I'm a transfer pricing specialist here in the UK in London. I have 15 years of experience helping clients design transfer pricing policies, prepare documentation, and engage with tax authorities. And looking forward to the session today.
Thanks a lot, Daniel. So just a quick kind of format. We're really going to try to stick to the 1 hour. I think it's important. Everyone has tight schedules. So we prefer to be a little bit under time than overtime. We have 3 topics. We're going to try to do 15 minutes per topic. And again, we're going to try to stick to our time. Olga and I have had some problems with that, but we're going to see how we go. And then we're going to have Q&A at the end. So hopefully on your browser, you can see there's a possibility to submit questions. Please fire away and we'll take the questions at the end. I can see your name if you submit a question. So, I will be able to pinpoint the nastiest questions to the people who submit them. So please be nice, but feel free to put some questions on the table. So with that, we're going to start. So firstly, as I said, it's a little bit of clickbait. We don't know if we have a recession yet, but certainly we have some uncertainty. We have super high inflation. We have interest rates at unprecedented levels for quite a while. And what happens next, we don't really know. So you can see here on this survey, we've asked a lot of CEOs, what are they worried about? Next 12 months, next 5 years. You can see on the left-hand side, next 12 months, the 2 main concerns are inflation and macroeconomic volatility. Exactly the same for the next 5 years, but the order is switched. So clearly, there is something coming our way. We can expect high interest rates. We can expect higher inflation. We can expect maybe a recession. Something will be happening. So I think we need to be prepared for that as TP advisors. On the right-hand side, you can see what the CEOs are thinking about doing. So how are they going to react, to this uncertainty? Again, very TP relevant potential actions. They could be adjusting their supply chain. They could be changing the markets they're operating in. They could be relocating workforce. They could be relocating physical assets. So super relevant TP discussions, moving people, moving operations, changing supply chain. It's something that's very relevant for TP. So the first takeaway for me is, looking forward, we're going to have these kind of issues popping up in our businesses and be ready for them. So what are your policies, when you have a close down? What are your policies when people change markets? What are your policies when you have, a low margin market or a loss-making market? If one person moves from one country to another country, does it matter? Thinking about physical assets, if you move them around, does it matter? What's your policy as a business? So I think getting ahead of the curve on those discussions is what I'd like to start with. Secondly, now we have a few kind of tools in the toolkit, takeaways. We got some really good guidance from the OECD regarding Corona, the COVID-19 period. It's not always we get good guidance from the OECD. Quite often it's kind of fluffy and very open to interpretation. But with this guidance, it was actually, in my opinion, really good. So coming into the next uncertainty period, I would say go back, check the guidance, think about what does it mean for your business? How could it apply if we have a depression, recession, high inflation? I think about that going forward. Of course, it's related to COVID, but I think a lot of the principles can be used in any uncertain or low margin, loss-making kind of period. Secondly, I would look into your TPDs and your intercompany contracts. Things like how do you deal with close-down costs again? What do you do when you have hyperinflation? Do you have a policy for that? Does it mention that in your contracts, in your TPD? What did you do for Turkey? What did you do for Venezuela? What did you do for Argentina? What is your reaction as a business to super high inflation? Interest rates is another one. If we have high interest rates for a sustained period of time, are your debt levels manageable? Could you change the amount of debt, reduce debt, but increase interest rates? Are there some tools you can play with there? I'd also be thinking about benchmark studies. Are you targeting a fixed number or are you targeting a range? Because if you're targeting a range, if the margins start going down in your business, you can actually move yourself down without changing your policy. So thinking about how do you build flexibility now into your transfer pricing before we maybe get some uncertainty and some lower margins. You still probably have your 2022 TPD open. So you can now, tighten the language, sharpen the language on inflation, market risk, close down costs to make sure if something happens, you'll be able to react and say, well, that was my policy. That's what I plan to do. So thinking through that now, I think is also very relevant. Thinking about APAs, we've actually had some pretty interesting scenarios. In some markets, in some industries, benchmark results have gone down significantly. So if you lock in an APA for 5 years now, based on these benchmark studies, you may lock in a very low margin for a 5-year period, which is a huge potential advantage. Also think about dispute resolution. We know we're going to get more audits. Tax authorities are going to come for the money, as they always do. So think about, are you ready for audits? What documentation do you have? What documentation do you need? I think what Daniel's going to talk about later today is very relevant. So think about, what would HMRC ask me for? Am I ready for that? There's some pretty interesting developments going on. And I think lastly, if you are in disputes, think about maps. Can you get double taxation avoided? Can you find ways to get cash back to your company and make sure that you have the cash flows you need? So I guess just thinking forward, thinking about what if this happens, am I ready for this? What if that happens? Is my documentation prepared? That's what I'd be looking at now. So Olga, I have a question for you.
Yeah.
We heard during the Corona period, that a lot of companies would go to the competent authorities and say, you know, I have my APA, but now my business margins have gone down so much. I'd actually like to revisit my APA and maybe reduce a negotiated margin. There was a lot of talk about that happening, but did you actually see it in practice?
Yeah, well, in my last year in the Danish Competent Authority, I did not see that happening. And there is a very good reason for that, I think. It's because, you know, competent authorities and tax authorities in many countries, they see an APA as an inflexible contract or agreement between the tax authorities and the taxpayer, meaning that, well, if times are fantastic and rosy and the profitability is high, then the tax authorities would still stick to the agreed terms. They wouldn't ask the taxpayer to actually, you know, renegotiate the agreement and maybe increase the margins agreed. So they expect the same approach from the taxpayer when the times are not necessarily good. So no, there are no renegotiations of APAs happening, even though COVID, of course, had impact on certain companies.
Okay, that's interesting. Because there was a lot of talk about that, but I think the flip side is exactly what I just discussed. I mean, if you can lock in a low margin now, you know, if the margins go up or down, you're in a pretty good position. And if the benchmark studies are showing lower numbers, it's a great time to be thinking about an APA.
Yeah, it definitely is. And also because the APAs are getting more popular. So recently there have been so many new initiatives. So OECD have issued a BAPA manual last year, and then multilateral APA and MAP manual this year. Then soon they will publish, so OECD made countries to publish APA statistics from next year. So we will have much more insights about APAs globally, what is successful, which two countries had, you know, better success rate in negotiating APAs. So there is clearly an increase of interest in the APA area.
Super. Olga, maybe you can give us an intro. I mean, what's happening in Skat, in the competent authority? What was your experiences? Of course, we can't share, you know, case-specific insights or don't give away any secrets, but I mean, tell us, you know, what we're seeing in there and what's happening.
Yeah, I definitely will. And we wanted to talk today particularly about a mutual agreement procedure. So I think I will just jump straight into the trends around that. And we know that MAP is a useful tool for companies, as ideally at the end of a MAP process, two competent authorities agree and would reach an agreement over who taxes what. And double taxation is either eliminated or at least reduced. But what I'm hearing, and we see it here, and this was my impression before I started in the Danish Competent Authority, is that quite a lot of taxpayers, you know, even large ones, they have negative perceptions in the MAP around MAP process, and a MAP takes a year to resolve. It may not even be accepted. It's such a strain on in-house resources. It means oversharing information. So it's like one audit on top of the other audit, right, to get your MAP. And you share with tax authorities at both sides, right? And then after all that effort, MAP can even fail. So let me just try to challenge this perception today. And last year was really successful for the Danish competent authorities in terms of how many MAPs have been solved. So last year they solved 150 cases, which is twice as many as just 2 years before. So this is a really high success rate, so to say. And one explanation of that is, of course, it's clearly that the OECD is pushing for MAP as a mechanism. Then it looks like the other countries, so Denmark is quite experienced in the area of MAP. There are, you know, the specialists working in DCA, they are fantastic. They have years of experience in this area. But Latvia, Poland, you know, many other European countries, they don't have that experience. So they are getting better. And also they're getting more comfortable with the fact that it's okay to give in on their tax revenue. So they're ready to compromise. The countries with whom Denmark had most MAP cases, at least, you know, several years before, are Germany, Sweden, Switzerland, Italy, Ireland, and the UK. So you could argue, and also from my experience, the DCA team has a chemistry with those countries, meaning that if you have a potential MAP, then it's quite likely that the solution will be found rather quickly. And also the statistics you can see on this screen, are, you know, they speak for themselves. So this is Denmark, 2021. 87% of transfer pricing map cases were fully resolved.
I mean, honestly, I think it's pretty impressive. And I have also heard from a lot of companies, my map is taking forever. You know, it's 1 year, it's 2 years, 3 years, but I guess it's moving in the right direction. And certainly, you know, getting outcomes is important. And it looks like that's what's happening.
Yes, exactly. So timing, yes, it is still an issue. And in 2021, the average time for Denmark to resolve a map case was 2 years and 3 months, which may sound long, but actually Denmark is in top 5 countries globally in terms of the speed of resolving a map case. And, you know, newer cases post-2016, the average period to resolve them is 1 year and 8 months. And in my experience, we have had quite a few cases which have been resolved in less than 1 year. So speaking of acceptance of a map request, in Denmark, it's pretty much automatic. So if you do some good investment into high quality map requests, then it's pretty much very likely that it will be accepted. Other countries might have different rules, so and also different practical experience. Sometimes, you know, we're hearing that a company has an audit in certain country, and then the auditor says, well, if you promise me not to go to map, then the adjustment will be not as high. I will lower it down. But clearly now the OECD has pointed out that no, that's not the right thing to do. A company should always have the right to map. So this means the acceptance is in a much better, in a much better state now than maybe even a few years before. Then, of course, 2 important things are to remember here. First of all, you have deadlines in a map. So to have a map, you need to confirm or, comply with certain deadlines. And second of all, there should be an actual or potential double taxation at the other side, because if there is not, then both Denmark and the other country may refuse to accept the map. So on the point of efforts required to get a successful map outcome, in my experience, ongoing check-in with the competent authority is a must if you want your case to progress. And remember that contrary to an audit situation, so the Danish competence authority role is to help the taxpayer to resolve the double taxation. And I've seen too often that when a taxpayer files a map request, then they just take all the materials from the audit, objections, comments, and all that, and they make it into an appendix to a map request and just file it like this huge pile of documents. But what does it result in? It means that the company itself equips 2 competent authorities with plenty of arguments to actually fight, and that is harming to find the solution and not helpful at all. So, yeah, in my experience, a concise, a straightforward map request often achieves, a better result than the very long one and this argumentative one, so to say.
Yeah, and I think that's actually super interesting, because I think the perception is, we need to put everything on the table. Every filing, every argument we made, we got to push it forward. Also, you move from an audit where you're in this adversarial situation into a map. Sometimes it's hard to switch gears from, okay, I was fighting these guys, and now we're kind of collaborating somehow.
Yes, yeah. Exactly. And of course, one thing to remember, Danish competent authority currently consists of fewer than 10 people, and they have huge workload. So the more you can actually help that person who is going to negotiate your case with another country, the better. Again, having said that, I think, and moving maybe to the last part, to the strategy around map cases, you still need to remember that you need to be careful with what you are presenting and how you are showing your information to the tax authorities within the map process, because the statistics are fantastic for Denmark, but nevertheless, rarely maps do fail. And when they do, then you are in a situation that not only have you incurred costs around the map process, but also you have made certain disclosures. So you might think, in advance, how am I showing my information, and what happens if, there is no solution agreed, or at some point, basically a litigation is on the cards. And then maybe the last thing I want to say about the strategy. So you need to think in advance, what is the solution that I want to get out of the map process? Because in the majority, if not in all slightly even complicated cases, the solution in the map case is a compromise one, meaning that the other country is prepared to only grant a partial corresponding adjustment to the Danish adjustment. And after the two competent authorities have agreed on a solution and fixed it in the minutes, you cannot change it. You can either accept it or you can reject it. And if you reject it, then you are double taxed and there's nothing you can do, right? So you can, go to litigation if you have preserved that option in advance. So do you have a preferred solution? Do you want to know the reasoning behind the solution? Because pretty much in all cases, those solutions in map cases are communicated back to taxpayers only in terms of numbers. So, how much is withdrawn of the adjustment and how much will be given correspondent adjustment, but no reasoning is provided. So you can think about how can I introduce into my map request, maybe what is that I'm aiming for, also thinking about future years if your transaction is ongoing. Yeah.
Super. Olga, thanks a lot. I'm watching the clock here, and we made some promises to keep on time. So I think I'm going to wrap up the first 15-minute session then. Basically, I think the takeaways are be prepared for what's coming down the pipe. We know there's some uncertainty. We know the types of situations which are coming your way. So think that through and be ready for that. And then be willing to use the map option. It is time consuming. It does take some resources, but it does work. So I think keep that in mind. We will have more disputes coming our way. So thanks, Olga. And then we're going to move over to Daniel. Quick introduction. Daniel and I are doing quite a lot of work together, and we're certainly seeing some pretty interesting cases. HMRC is, and has been for a while, quite ahead of the curve. They're putting in new rules constantly, which are enabling them to audit companies in a whole different way. So I think when you're listening to what Daniel presents today, think about this being a trend, the beginning of a trend which we're going to see in other tax authorities pick up. So with that, Daniel, I throw it over to you for the good news from the UK.
Thanks, Tim. So I'm going to provide a brief update from a UK transfer pricing perspective. Before I jump into it, I would just echo all of the points that have been raised already this morning. We're certainly seeing those points from a UK context as well. Groups having to deal not only with greater transfer pricing guidance in a post-BEPS world, but also world events such as the COVID pandemic, supply chain challenges, inflationary environment, and also greater global mobility and digitalization. Plus, obviously, we have Brexit here in the UK. So there's certainly lots of stress points on transfer pricing policies that need considering. So from a UK perspective, there have been some interesting developments in recent years that Tim alluded to. And these are around tax authority engagement, audit activity, and documentation requirements that we thought were worth bringing to your attention, not only for those of you with UK operations to consider, but also, as Tim mentioned, we're likely to see these broad trends develop across other tax administrations. So I'd say historically, the UK has been a little bit of an outlier when it comes to transfer pricing documentation requirements compared to other OECD developed economies, in the sense that it hasn't really had any prescriptive rules. However, that's now changing. So for accounting periods beginning on or after 1st of April 2023, where the taxpayer meets the country-by-country reporting revenue threshold, 750 million euros, then there's a requirement to prepare OECD master file and local file documents. So that's a key takeaway, that the UK will be consistent with many other developed OECD countries in having to prepare transfer pricing documentation in line with a format I'm sure many of you are already familiar with. Now, what's perhaps a little more interesting is what's in consultation, and that's a summary audit trail, or SAT as we're calling it. Now, this is likely to be a questionnaire detailing the main actions the business has taken in preparing the transfer pricing local file document. So this is focused more on processes and behaviors as opposed to factual or technical content. Now we're waiting to see the final form of this, but for example, we might expect the SAT to require commentary on how the functional analysis was prepared in the local file document. So who in the business were interviewed, who in the UK business were interviewed, when were these interviews conducted, etc. Similarly, when was the last time the economic analysis was updated? Is it 5 years ago, or was it last year, or is it, really up to date with contemporaneous data? And this is all driven by a desire to understand how transfer pricing policies and documentation have been frequently updated to ensure alignment with how the business operates. The macroeconomic trends, some of which we've been talking about, and specific fact patterns relevant to the transfer price. So how are you ensuring that the functional analysis in your documentation is keeping pace with what's happening on the ground? How are you ensuring that the economic analysis in your documentation is keeping pace not only with what's happening on the ground with your business, but incorporating these other sort of global macro trends? Now, this is indicative of what we're seeing more generally with HMRC and audit activity. Transfer pricing is seen as a key priority and one of, if not the biggest source of additional tax yield for HMRC. So we're seeing intensive audit activity where HMRC are requesting significant amounts of information and evidence to support the transfer pricing policy. So I'd say managing transfer pricing risks, across your complex groups, as well as proactively managing a tax audit in order to try and reach a positive resolution, ideally in a sensible time frame, is very much a priority. So I'd say another key takeaway from this session is that transfer pricing documentation, certainly in the UK, is seen in a broader sense and goes beyond just the preparation of your OECD transfer pricing master file, local file. So we just click on to the next slide there. This is an extract from some HMRC guidance around broader records and evidence. And I think I would in particular highlight that last bullet point to say evidence to support arm's length results. This is really a critical point. Focused on this. Now, and also an interesting development, again, that Tim alluded to, was HMRC have introduced a profit diversion compliance facility, nicknamed a PDCF. Now, this is designed to encourage businesses, those that are potentially impacted, to review their tax policies, change them as appropriate, and use the facility to submit a report with a proposal to pay any additional tax, potentially with interest and penalties. So it's effectively asking taxpayers to conduct an audit on themselves. Now, whilst this PDCF is a voluntary facility, it is really indicative of the approach that we're seeing HMRC adopt in the course of audits as well, which unfortunately are not voluntary. So in terms of evidence, again, this critical point, the PDCF guidance states that relevant facts should reference the evidence from which they are derived, and that evidence should be appropriate and reliable. So, for example, an interview with a tax manager designed to understand the sales activity of a senior executive is likely to be far less relevant or useful than an interview with the senior sales executive themselves, or at least one of their sales team. So this sort of circles back to your process and behaviors for assessing your transfer prices and preparing your documentation. When you're developing your functional analysis, how are you doing that? Who are you speaking to? Those are the type of questions that HMRC would dig into. And I think there'd be an expectation that you're frequently speaking to the right people on the ground in the UK. Now, the PDCF guidance also goes on to state, in preparing that evidence, you should be looking to interview staff and managers of the business in the UK and abroad, potentially interviewing customers or suppliers of the business where it's considered necessary in order to fully understand the importance of the customer relationship, and obtaining relevant contemporaneous communications and documentary evidence. And they explicitly state, for example, reviewing emails sent and received for or by relevant staff. And this is something we're seeing in audits as well, HMRC requesting a sample of emails for certain senior individuals. So I'd say, that last point is a really interesting one, because often we see functional analysis interviews in the course of an audit, but over and above that, HMRC seek to audit a sample of email communications, really to understand and evidence how those key commercial decisions are made and by whom. And that can be quite challenging and complex and resource intensive, and it entails sort of IT, legal considerations around sort of how do you extract those emails, how do you ensure confidentiality is preserved, etc. Now, the last point I wanted to raise was around penalties. So there have been significant changes to penalties and information powers in the UK as well. And so recent changes to legislation has enabled the right for HMRC to request transfer pricing documentation outside of a formal transfer pricing inquiry, which is new. There's been the removal of the requirement for documents to be in the power and possession of a UK entity. And I think, again, this last point is really important. There's a presumption of carelessness where a taxpayer fails to do the work necessary to maintain or to produce relevant records on request. And that has knock-on implications for penalties, often penalties which are based on any potential transfer pricing adjustments, scale up or down based on what HMRC might consider to be the level of due care or lack of that a taxpayer might have taken. And this again circles back to the summary audit trail and the processes and behaviours and how you can demonstrate that as a business you're taking due care in arriving at arm's length pricing. So HMRC are required to consider penalties, and as I say, they do focus on care being taken. We know that transfer pricing is subjective, and one can always arrive at slightly different conclusions. But again, it's thinking back to that functional analysis, economic analysis, how much contemporaneous work is required in order for you to demonstrate due care has been taken. And it does feel like in the UK, we've seen that bar be raised in recent years, both through the formal introduction of new documentation requirements, the introduction of the PDCF, and just generally in audit activity. So just to provide a sort of brief recap then, we've got new UK transfer pricing documentation requirements, OECD and master file, local file, which a lot of you will be familiar with. Potentially a new summary audit trail, which is under consultation. We've got the profit diversion compliance facility and audit activity, very intensive, that we're seeing a real focus on processes, behaviours and evidence in supporting transfer pricing policies and demonstrating a due care has been taken. So as Tim says, there's a lot of interesting developments here in the UK that you should be aware of, but I think we're expecting and maybe already starting to see some of these trends spread across other tax administrations as well. Happy to pick up questions towards the end, but for now, I'll hand back over to you, Tim.
Thank you, Daniel. It's super interesting. There's already, I can see questions coming already, but we'll come to that at the end. I think it's fascinating. I mean, this self-audit, you basically, you're asked to assess yourself and you're expected to come up with an adjustment. It's almost like your policies were wrong by default before the audit. I mean, it's kind of a crazy approach, but, it's what we're seeing. I think very practically, think about when did you do your last functional interviews, because that question is so easy to ask. When did you last interview, to make this documentation? And if the answer is a couple of years ago, then HMRC are going to sit there and say, that's great, but it doesn't reflect where the business is now. And I think that applies, more generally. So that's one very practical takeaway. I think also, Daniel, that the question around audits and emails, and we're seeing that in a number of jurisdictions now. And I know you've seen cases where the email requests have been huge. Maybe you can just give a quick, intro on that and what you've been seeing.
Yeah, certainly. So a couple of recent examples where, we've had, say, 10 plus functional analysis interviews, but despite that, HMRC have requested to review emails for a select number of individuals. And there's discussion around, okay, well, who are those people and what's the time period that you want to look at? But it has led to thousands, sometimes it's tens of thousands of emails that the business has to go away and collect and share with HMRC. And it's very resource intensive, both from a taxpayer and HMRC perspective. And as I touched on, it brings in sort of IT, legal considerations around confidentiality. And I think it's indicative of HMRC going to the nth degree to really try and validate and understand any assertions made in informing the transfer pricing and made in the transfer pricing documentation. I think clients tend to get quite surprised, I find, in the course of UK audits about the sheer volume and depth of information that HMRC are requesting, often very specific items, but also just broad requests to say, can you please provide all external and internal correspondence on this point? And often it's difficult because some of those people that were involved at the time have left the business. And so that presents challenges in finding the information as well, and perhaps putting into context some of the email correspondence.
Super, thanks, Daniel. I mean, that's certainly, we see it in Denmark too. There are requests for emails and significant requests for emails. That's something we need to be getting ready for. So it's certainly a trend we see more broadly. But thank you very much, Daniel. We're going to move on to our last segment to try to keep to our time. There's an expression in show business. I mean, I don't think that's where we are, but never do live shows with kids or animals. And I think we can add to that, don't do live demos of technology. But we're going to try today anyway. So, we're doing a lot of work on automation, low code, no code, visualization as an integrated part of our transfer pricing. And Bori is a big part of that. So Bori's going to run us through an example of what the kinds of things we do. And the idea is, in a recession or downturn period, being accurate with the transfer pricing is increasingly important. It can also save you time so you can spend time on more important things. But Bori will run us through that. So Bori, I throw it over to you.
Thank you, Tim. So before I jump into the demonstration part, I just want to have a brief introduction on the automated tools that we can create and what are the benefits and what are the challenges that these are provide a solution to. So basically we see, as Daniel also touched upon, a global tendency that more and more jurisdictions are also introducing a more profound or more transparent requirements on data-heavy processes that are relevant for transfer pricing. And what we see in these processes is sometimes it's very difficult and very inconsistent how companies manage their data. It can be because of different data volumes, different data granularity. So the input data is not very clear. And on secondary, it's also not easy to track the data history. What was the approach of calculating markups, margins for group entities that are operating on a limited risk basis, so they have a target margin as a TP policy. And this can, in turn, lead to a significant bulk adjustment at year end, which can carry some compliance risk. And it can also create liquidity issues for group entities, which is, especially in the current time, is very relevant to try to not to have. Overall, we also see that such inconsistent data management can lead to an inconsistent and reactive approach to responding to a potential local tax audit. So some of the anticipated benefits of such an automated tool, first and foremost, it reduces significantly manual work, and it frees up resources for the company to focus on more value-add tasks and not to repeat very basic manual tasks over and over and basically waste time. It also gives huge transparency, and it's way easier to monitor and plan ahead. The tax planning and the analysis capacity will be enhanced basically by using these tools. It's also important to note that it can improve the reaction time in case one sees an unexpected performance from a group entity. Let's say they are loss-making and they are in big trouble, and they might have a liquidity risk that they cannot handle on their own. This can be reduced, and this allows to react more in a timely manner if such tools are implemented. And at the end, in case of potential local transfer pricing audit, it also allows a more profound and more proactive approach where one can show that we actually made a tool, we are transparent with our data, we are transparent our approach with how we calculate our margins, and we can show these to the authorities if that's needed. And now I would like to show one example of a profitability tracker tool. This is just one out of many different processes that we can automate and we can optimize. And with that, I would like to show my screen and start the demonstration.
Okay, maybe Bori, while you're doing that, just to give some context, yeah, this is a, as Bori said, this is a discrete example, for a contract manufacturer or an LRD, but it could be, anything that you're making charges. Could be intercompany IT charges, could be HQ charges, could be any cost allocation. It could be LRDs, contract manufacturers, contract R&D, anything where you're doing manual work repeatedly and need to manage margins or costs. This kind of process can be used. So then we're going to go, Bori, best of luck.
Thank you. I hope you can all see the screen. So what I'm showing now is basically an interactive dashboard that helps you track profitability. And just a very quick introduction. In this example, we have a group, and in their value chain, they both have the manufacturing and they also have distribution entities worldwide. And they also use benchmarks for their testing of their markup. So how does this actually work, and how does it look? Why is this actually beneficial? When we go to the next dashboard, what you see here is that on the top, you see entities that are in red. They are representing entities that are outside of the benchmark interquarter range that would carry a bigger risk on an adjustment at year end. The green entities, however, are within the interquarter range and closer to the target. So that's a lower risk. So no attention needs to be given to those. But for example, if we dig deeper into Europe, we can see that out of 5 jurisdictions where this company is present, only 2 are within the interquarter range. Norway, Poland, and Sweden, they can expect a bigger bulk adjustment at year end. So this is on the top, these are the margins. And on the bottom, you can dig deeper and see in real time how the actual adjustment would look like at year end if we don't react to this profitability status at this stage in the year. And even if we go further, we can also see the financials of each entity. Again, if we screen for example, to Europe, you see all the distributing entities and how their financials are. So this can all help make a more timely decision, and rather being reactive, being proactive, and make more informed decisions if something is not as expected. And I think with that, I will give back the word for Tim. Thank you.
And I mean, this is, of course, a very simple example, but the idea is, if you can find a way to extract data automatically from your ERP environment, push it into a automation tool like Ultrix, and then have some visualizations like this, all of a sudden you have the ability to do something that maybe was a very difficult task or time-consuming task you did once a year, you can do it every month. So, and do it automated. So this is what we're working a lot on now. We're building a lot of these kind of tools and to be more accurate and to be, more regular in our adjustments. So super interesting part of the TP practice these days.
And just to add to that, exactly, I think one of the point, because it's maybe the year-end adjustment is just one process, but again, you can monitor this more frequently. You can just check up on how everyone is performing in the group.
Yeah, super.
Which is really nice.
Thanks, Bori. Well, then I think a minor miracle has occurred. We are more or less on track timing-wise. So I'm going to flick through to Q&A. So we have some pretty good questions. I'll take the easiest one first. Is it possible to get the slides for this presentation? Yes, of course, it's possible. I'm not exactly sure how we'll share, but probably by email afterwards, or we'll share a link, but you will get the slides, so no problem there. And that's a good question. Then we have, I think, a very interesting one. We have an anonymous question here that, that basically pushes back a little bit, Olga, on what you were saying. So the old trade that was, I'll give you a deal in the local audit if you don't go to MAP. One of our questions is, I still see that a lot. What can we do in this situation?
All right. So, well, fair question, as mentioned. What can you do? I think first and foremost, you can check legal or regulatory in that specific country, right? Because this is a very domestic thing. Does the local legislation allows for anything like that? That's I would say the first step. The second step, I think, what is often, it gets back to what we're talking about was this mindset, audit and then MAP. These are two different things. Audit is controversy, MAP is solution seeking. But at the level of tax authorities, of course, these are also two different teams. So people who audit companies, I don't know, in Germany, for example, they are completely and totally different from people who are then negotiating the MAP. So what you could be thinking about doing, how can I actually talk to my auditor and then tell him, maybe can you speak to your competent authority? Because those people, I know that they have good connection and then they will find a solution to that audit in the MAP process. So then you also are happy. Right? So that is a little bit of relationship question, of course. And then I think, we have to wait and we have to see what the OECD is doing next, because there is a clear message from them that that is not the right thing to do.
I think it's also a maturity question. I mean, I guess as jurisdictions get more and more mature, they should do this less and less. But we still see it. I mean, that's how it is.
Exactly.
But I definitely think it's a great point. You know, competent authority mindset is so different to audit mindset. So if you can move a case to competent authority, it's just a different discussion. And that also speaks in favor of, you know, if you are thinking about an APA, you can basically avoid that audit discussion, avoid the nastiness and then the horse trading, and move into a proactive situation.
Of course, if you have recurrent audits, then the APA is exactly the tool for that, right? Because what is an APA? It's the process where you can actually, you know, focus the attention of that audit team or several audit teams on specific issues which you want them to focus attention, rather than just, you know, in the audit scenario, they pick up whatever they think is relevant. In the APA scenario, you are managing that part.
Yep. So you direct them to the things you think or you want them to look at. Yes.
Exactly.
All right, super question. Thank you very much. I've got another easy question coming in here. Has the webinar been recorded? Yes is the answer, and we will also share a link. So then you can have your presentation on one side and the pre-recorded webinar, and you can watch both and look at the same time as many times as you would like. Another question here, Daniel, this one's for you. I think we have a permanent establishment in the UK question. Would the rules you just ran through, would that equally apply to a PE?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think there's perhaps I can maybe elaborate a little bit on instances where these rules don't formally apply, which might be the case of a permanent establishment, or also if your revenue threshold is below the 750 million sort of country by country reporting definition. Unfortunately, if you don't fall within the scope of this, it doesn't mean that you don't have to prepare any transfer pricing documentation, and you don't need to worry about the things that we've been talking about. I would take all of the themes and the intent behind the new legislation and what we're seeing in the audit activity as things that should also be thought about in preparing documentation for slightly smaller groups, or if it's in the context of a branch profit attribution. So again, if you've got a smaller activity or a branch profit attribution, you know, how frequently are you looking at that? How are you establishing the facts and what the correct transfer pricing or profit attribution is? There is reference in the OECD guidelines and UK transfer pricing sort of guidance around the level of work undertaken and documentation prepared being commensurate with the sort of scale and complexity of the activity. So I suppose if the activity of the UK branch is relatively straightforward, relatively small, then it might be that some kind of light touch approach is appropriate. But again, just thinking about how can you demonstrate that you've looked at this frequently and got comfortable with the branch profit attribution, even if you're not having to prepare the full OECD style local file documentation. So I think it's always in the back of your mind, having a thought for what are my processes, controls, behaviors around this transfer price, around this UK profit attribution, even if we fall below the specific requirements.
Super. Thanks, Daniel. There's a lot of questions here, so I'm sorry we're not going to get through to everyone, but I'll take another one now. Would you do monthly, quarterly adjustments rather than a year-end adjustment? And this is a question that's very close to my heart. I think if you put things on a spectrum, you know, if you're talking about goods trading, you know, the least, let's say, favorable or preferable option would be one massive year-end adjustment. You know, so you're not even adjusting goods pricing. You're just saying, boom, here's some cash one way or the other. That's worst case, because you open the door up for corporate tax deductibility issues. I don't want to make that payment, or that payment's not deductible. You open yourselves up for customs and indirect tax issues. So the goods pricing throughout the year was incorrect, effectively. Transfer pricing issues too. So that's kind of one end of the spectrum. I think so. if you can adjust goods pricing throughout the year rather than making profit adjustments, you're moving to a better position. And of course, the more regularly you can adjust goods pricing throughout the year, the better. So you can move kind of further up the spectrum. I mean, of course, you could do it every month, but that's going to be a huge effort. So I think finding the balance between being practical but also being accurate is what you want to aim for. And different for every company, different for every type of transaction, but a really good conversation to have, that's for sure.
Can I add to that?
Sure, Barry.
It's just we quite recently had also a discussion with PwC Argentina because in some jurisdictions they actually don't allow by regulation, local regulation, these year-end voluntary adjustments. So in case there is an operation and limited risk basis in these countries, then a more frequent in-year adjustment can be a possible solution for these cases as well.
Absolutely. It's funny, sometimes when you send the money, that's okay.
Yeah.
But when you want to take money out of the country, not okay. But I think general rule, try to move towards in-year goods pricing as much as possible and then try to find the right rhythm that works for your business. Olga, I'm going to give you a quick minute on a quick question.
Go ahead.
There's a rumor question here that apparently the tax authorities will pay for your map process. What's your take on that?
My take on that, yes, formally the expenses incurred during the map process, they can be reimbursed by the Danish state. There are rules for that. Having said that, it's very uncommon that, taxpayers those who even got a good map solution or, accepted the map solution, that they claim those expenses. I think there is not a widespread tradition of doing so, but you definitely can. There are certain rules about that, and they're quite strict. So to give an example, it's only the Danish entity who has incurred expenses on advisors. Those can be claimed. If you have an entity in the Netherlands or in the UK who also involved local advisors, those expenses cannot be reimbursed by Denmark. So the answer is yes, but be careful and think about, whether this is the right thing to do.
Yeah. Super. Then I'm going to wrap us up now, I think. Really a big thank you for everyone who joined. We know you're busy. We know, your time is valuable, so we very much appreciate you joining today. Any feedback on what we presented, how we presented is very much welcome. We want to improve and get better. And just to give you a little teaser for what's coming your way, the next webinar will be on operational transfer pricing. That's on Wednesday, May 3. Also at breakfast coffee time, which is a nice way to start the day. Then we have Brazil on the 23rd of May, and that's the many-year-old discussion around will they actually introduce the OECD rules. I know a lot of people are really interested in this. If you're in Brazil, you know how painful it is with TP over there. So this could be a great change, but likely they do a Brazilian version of OECD because everything's different in Brazil. But we're going to hear more about that on the 23rd of May. And then I'd just like to finish by thanking Olga, Bori, and Daniel on the line as well. Thank you for your time and thank you for being part of this. And then I say thank you to our audience and wish you a very nice day.